My life was a lie. For 4 long years, my daughter took care of me while I was sick. But a routine follow-up visit at the hospital changed everything. The doctor said in a trembling voice, "Call the police immediately." He didn't look at me like a patient. He looked at me like a crime scene. When I looked at my own medical records, I was so shocked I could barely breathe. But I didn't cry. I wasn't disappointed. It was just that now I had to face the hardest decision of my life: continue playing the victim or become a hunter again. If the words "call the police" gave you chills, stay with me. Before I continue, comment where you're watching from. Like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Please note, this is a fictional story with dramatized elements for meaningful reflection. If it's not for you, feel free to explore other content that suits you better. The smell of rubbing alcohol always reminded me of the morgue. But today, as I struggled to draw a full breath, the sterile scent felt like my own shroud. I am Willis Osborne, a 68-year-old retired Savannah homicide detective with a silver-gray beard and hands calloused from decades of woodworking. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a crime scene waiting to be processed. I sat rigidly on the exam table, the cold, crinkling paper beneath me sounding like dry leaves under a stalker's boot. Across the room, my son Lennox Osborne, a 44-year-old man with my own sharp eyes and a restless energy that usually translated into breaking down doors, stood by the hospital window with his arms tightly crossed. His leather jacket creaked every time he shifted his weight, a sound of barely contained violence. I looked at my reflection in the glass of the medical cabinets and barely recognized the hollowed-out ghost staring back. My brain felt as though it were wrapped in wet wool, a fog I had been living in for months. But this morning, I had done something reckless. I had bypassed the small plastic cup of morning supplements and heart medication my caregiver Zelma so dutifully prepared for me. Within 3 hours, the wool had begun to fray. The fog was lifting, revealing a terrifying clarity I wasn't sure I was ready to face. "I have chased killers for 30 years, Lennox," I said, my voice sounding like gravel grinding in a tin can. "I know the look of a man who isn't coming back." My son turned from the window, his jaw set in a line of iron. "Not today, Dad. Not on my watch." He wanted to believe in a natural decline, a graceful exit for the great detective. But we both knew the math didn't add up. The hum of the HVAC system filled the silence, a low, mechanical drone that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. Tick, tick, tick. The wall clock wasn't measuring time. It was measuring my remaining heartbeats. I could taste fear in the back of my throat, a metallic tang like sucking on a copper penny. Doctor Zandra Sinclair, a 46-year-old toxicologist with sharp features and a direct gaze that could pierce body armor, entered the room holding my chart as if it were a ticking bomb. She didn't offer a smile. She didn't offer the usual professional pleasantries. She pulled a rolling stool close to me, her face a mask of analytical horror. "Willis, your heart isn't giving up." She began, her voice low and dangerous. "It is being pushed." I gripped the edge of the exam table, my calloused fingers digging into the foam. "Give it to me straight, Zandra. No professional courtesy." She laid out the blood work on the desk, a chaotic map of chemical warfare that showed my internal systems were under siege. "This isn't age, and it isn't natural decay. Your potassium levels are erratic, and your cardiac enzymes are screaming. Someone is systematically introducing an agent into your system to mimic heart failure." My mind flashed to the kitchen table at Isle of Hope, to the gentle smile Zelma gave me every morning as she handed me my tea and my pills. How do you tell a man his life's work, protecting people, failed at his own dinner table? The betrayal felt like a second heart attack, colder and more permanent than the first. Zandra leaned in her eyes, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. "The levels in this most recent draw are astronomical, Willis. Whoever is doing this isn't just trying to weaken you anymore. They have increased the dosage significantly. If this continues, you won't last another 48 hours. My breath hitched a sharp pain blooming in my chest that had nothing to do with chemistry. Dr. Sinclair slid the report across the desk, her finger landing on the chemical name highlighted in yellow. It's digoxin Willis, and based on your pharmacy records, you haven't been prescribed this in 20 years. The name of the poison hung in the air like a death sentence I had already signed and witnessed. In the heavy, toxic silence that followed Dr. Sinclair's exit, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with a judgmental electricity. My hands were like ice resting uselessly on my knees, while the sterile smell of the hospital room began to feel like a cage. Lennox stood motionless, his heavy breathing the only sound competing with the hum of the building. I knew what he was thinking, but he didn't know the whole truth yet. I admitted to him that the only reason I was sitting there still breathing was because I had been purposefully spilling at least half of every meal and tea Zelma brought me for the last 3 months. I had become a master of the accidental stumble, the shaky hand that sent a cup clattering to the floor. It was a pathetic way to stay alive, but it had bought me the clarity I needed for this day. Lennox let out a ragged breath, the plastic chair creaking under his shifting weight as he finally sat down. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and desperate confusion. A detective is trained to see the truth. Lennox, I said, my voice barely a whisper in the cold room. A father is trained to bury it. I took him back to a Tuesday in late 2018. It wasn't a lab report that first tipped me off. It was the way her eyes lingered on my trust fund documents when she thought I was napping. I watched her stir my supposed health shake and saw a slight tremor in her hands that wasn't there before. I told myself it was love, or perhaps just the stress of caregiving. I was a fool who traded my badge for a blindfold because I couldn't face the rot in my own home. My heart was an old clock, and Zelma was slowly removing the gears one by one, smiling as she watched the hands slow down. I sat there and let it happen for far too long, paralyzed by the shame of being a victim in my own sanctuary. Lennox gripped the edge of the consultation table, his knuckles turning white. "Why didn't you call me?" he asked, the hurt in his voice sharper than any blade. "Why did you let her keep going if you knew I leaned back feeling the coldness of my own skin? Because I needed more than just a suspicion. I needed a file that would hold up in the highest court in Georgia. I haven't been as passive as you think, son." I revealed to him that I had been keeping a secret log hidden inside my woodworking shop, tucked away in a hollowed-out cedar box beneath the floorboards. Every dose she administered, every dizzy spell that sent the room spinning, every time my heart skipped a beat like a dying engine, it was all documented with the precision of a crime scene technician. I described the agonizing mental toll of documenting my own slow murder while smiling at my grandchildren and letting her kiss my cheek. Betrayal has a specific taste. It is copper and cold sweat. It's a bitter tea that stays on the tongue long after the cup is empty. I told Lennox that the journal wasn't just a record of symptoms. Hidden within the digital backup in that box was a recorded audio file. I had left my phone's voice recorder running during a night when she thought I was deep in a drug-induced sleep. I heard her talking to herself, whispering about finishing it, and how much easier everything would be once the old man was finally out of the way. It was a piece of evidence so damning I hadn't even found the words to tell Dr. Sinclair about it. I looked my son in the eye, the detective finally overtaking the father in my soul. "I have enough to put her away for life, Lennox, but I need to know why she's doing it before I pull the trigger. Memory is a fickle lens, but for a detective, it's a crime scene that never gets cleaned up." I closed my eyes and let the antiseptic hospital air dissolve into the scent of cedar and roasting garlic. The sterile white walls of the medical center faded, replaced by the golden, hazy light of a Georgia sunset in the spring of 2018. Back then, my heart beat with a steady, powerful rhythm, and my hands didn't tremble when I held a chisel. I was in my woodworking shop at the Isle of Hope estate, finishing the curved back of a rocking chair for my grandson. Zelma had arrived earlier that afternoon, looking every bit the devoted daughter in a sundress that caught the breeze. She hadn't just brought a bottle of expensive wine. She had also presented a small amber bottle containing a new brand of vitamins. She claimed they were cutting-edge supplements, for my longevity a secret weapon against the creeping years. I accepted them with a grateful smile, touched by her apparent concern for my health, and swallowed the first one without a second thought. Outside the shop, the garden was a vibrant tapestry of green and gray. Ria, my 7-year-old granddaughter with pigtails that never stayed straight, was a burst of pure light against the somber backdrop of the estate as she chased a butterfly near the azaleas. Toby, at 9, already had the quiet, focused intensity that reminded me too much of myself when I was a rookie beat cop sitting on the grass and sketching the moss-draped oaks. Zelma leaned against the doorframe of the shop, the cool condensation on her wine glass catching the light. "You're working too hard, Dad?" she said, her voice smooth as honey. "You should be putting your feet up and enjoying the view." I blew a layer of sawdust off the cedar plank and looked up at her. "Wood doesn't lie to you, Zelma. It tells you exactly where the rot is if you know how to look. Why is it that the clearest warnings are always written in the smallest font, hidden behind a daughter's smile?" We moved to the dining room as the sun dipped lower, the air filling with the comforting smell of roasted garlic. Dinner was a celebration of family, or so I thought. But as the meal progressed, the atmosphere shifted, growing heavy with unspoken intentions. Zelma began to speak about her mounting business expenses at the pharmacy, her tone light, but her eyes searching mine for a reaction. She pivoted the conversation toward the management of the family trust, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. "It's just that Lennox is so far away in Richmond," she murmured, her gaze dropping to the table. "I want to make sure the estate is handled by someone who's actually here, someone who truly understands the value of this place and your shop." I felt a subtle unease prickle at the back of my neck. I had seen that look before in interrogation rooms. It was a predator's hunger masked as filial concern. "The trust is settled, honey." I replied, my voice calm but firm. "It's for the kids' future, not ours." Her laughter was like the Spanish moss hanging from the oaks outside, beautiful from a distance, but capable of strangling the life out of everything it touched. She quickly changed the subject to Toby's schoolwork, but the shadow remained. After the children were tucked in and Zelma prepared to leave, I walked her to the door. As she reached for her bag, a small piece of paper fluttered from her pocket to the mahogany floor. She didn't notice the soft scratch of paper against the wooden table as she stepped out into the night. I picked it up, expecting a grocery list or a receipt. Instead, I found a meticulously scribbled list of my assets, each with an estimated market value written beside it. My woodworking equipment, the vintage tools, the estate itself. It was all there, calculated down to the penny. I stared at that list, the ink still fresh, and for the first time in my own home, I felt the unmistakable chill of being watched by a hunter. The first time the world tilted on its axis, I thought it was just the Georgia heat, a heavy blanket of humidity trying to smother a man who had seen too many summers. I stood in my woodworking shop, the scent of fresh pine shavings usually a balm for my soul. But today it felt cloying, almost suffocating. I blinked, trying to clear the strange, nauseating yellow glow that had begun to ring the shop lights. It was a halo I recognized from an old homicide file involving digitalis toxicity, a case from a decade ago that I had tucked away in the back of my mind. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The poisoning hadn't started with the recent dizzy spells. It had been woven into my life for months, subtle and insidious. I tried to focus on the grain of the cedar wood beneath my hands, those hands that had once been steady enough to defuse a bomb or pull a trigger with surgical precision. Now they were betraying me, a fine tremor rippling through my fingers like wind over water. I heard the screen door of the porch creak open and knew Zelma was watching me. She didn't say anything at first, just leaned against the railing with an expression I couldn't quite decode. I forced a smile I didn't feel and looked toward her. "I'm fine, Zelma. Just a bit of a head rush," I said, my voice sounding thinner than I remembered. She stepped down into the yard, her face a mask of concern that didn't reach her eyes. "You're not fine, Dad. Your heart is working too hard. You need to take the new supplements I bought for you. They're right there by your water glass." I looked at the small amber bottle on the workbench and felt a cold knot of dread tighten in my stomach. Denial is a powerful narcotic, and even as the detective in me screamed the truth, the father in me wanted to believe she was just being overprotective. Thump, thump. Silence. Thump. My heart was a drummer who had forgotten the beat. I reached for a chisel, determined to finish the delicate joint for Toby's chair, but the room decided to spin. The floor rose up to meet me as a massive wave of nausea crashed over my head. There was a sickening thump in my chest, a sensation of my heart leaping against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I lost my balance, my shoulder clipping the corner of the workbench as I fell. The running saw was only inches from my face, its mechanical hum a mocking growl before I managed to kick the power cord loose. I landed hard on the sawdust-covered floor, the grit of it getting into my mouth, mixing with the metallic tang of blood where I'd bitten my tongue. "Stay down. Just breathe," I commanded myself, but my legs felt like lead weights. Why won't my legs move? The vibration of the floor against my cheek brought a terrifying clarity. The pills. It started with the pills she gave me every morning with such a devoted smile. Have you ever felt your own betrayal? It's not a thought. It's a cold sweat that starts at the base of your spine and tells you that your home is no longer a sanctuary. I lay there helpless, listening to the rhythmic mocking tick of the workshop clock. Then I heard it. Footsteps, light, rhythmic, and unmistakable. They stopped just outside the shop door. I expected the door to fly open, expected to hear my daughter's panicked voice calling my name. Instead, there was only a heavy, deliberate silence. I held my breath, my ear pressed to the wood of the floor. She was standing right there, just inches away, listening to my struggle. I could almost picture her checking her watch, waiting to see if the fall would finish what the chemistry had started. After a long, agonizing minute, the footsteps moved again. They didn't come inside. They simply retreated, fading back toward the main house with a chilling lack of urgency. I watched the shadow of her shoes retreat through the gap under the door, the silence she left behind, louder than any scream for help. To survive a predator, you must first convince them you've already been caught. But pretending to be helpless is a dangerous game when you're actually dying. I didn't call out as I lay on the workshop floor watching the shadow of Zelma's shoes retreat. If I was going to survive, I had to stop acting like prey and start acting like a man who was already defeated. When she finally returned 10 minutes later, breathless and performing a frantic dance of concern, I let her move me to the master bedroom. My home, where I had raised her for 30 years, began to feel like a beautifully decorated tomb. I realized then that she had already changed the locks on the heavy oak doors, effectively trapping me inside, before I even understood the depth of the threat. She moved with a clinical efficiency, transforming my room into a makeshift infirmary that smelled of lavender and bleach, a scent meant to mask the rot of betrayal. Zelma installed herself as my primary caregiver with a chilling speed, claiming that Lennox was too busy with the firm in Richmond to handle the daily burden. "I'm the only one who can keep you safe now, Dad," she would say while smoothing my sheets with hands that felt like ice. I watched her from my pillows, noting how she had already begun to reorganize my personal files and checkbooks on the vanity, claiming she was just cleaning up the clutter. "You're doing too much, Zelma," I whispered, playing the part of the fading patriarch. "I don't want to be a burden to you." She only smiled, a thin, sharp expression that never reached her eyes, and continued her silent inventory of my life. Is it possible to love someone and fear them in the same breath? I was a detective who had solved 100 murders, yet I couldn't find the strength to solve my own. I lay in the dim light of the afternoon, listening to the rhythmic mocking tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The Osborne estate had always been full of life, but now the silence was a physical weight. Zelma stepped into the adjoining bathroom to prepare my evening drink, leaving the door slightly ajar. She didn't realize that from my position on the bed, I had a clear view through the angle of the silver-edged vanity mirror. I watched her reflection, my heart stuttering in my chest. She pulled a hidden vial from the pocket of her cardigan and used a small metal crusher. The metallic scrape of the pill crusher against the marble counter sounded like a bone breaking. I saw the clinical focus on her face, no hesitation, no remorse as she reduced white tablets into a fine, lethal powder and stirred them into a glass of water. When she returned to the bedside, she was the picture of daughterly devotion once more. "Drink it all, Dad," she said softly, holding the glass to my lips. "It'll help the tremors." I looked at the water, then up at her. "Thank you, sweetheart. You always know exactly what I need." I felt a paralyzing sense of betrayal, a coldness that started in my marrow and radiated outward. But as I took the glass, a perverse, desperate hope flared up within me, a fatherly desire to prove myself wrong, to see if she would truly let me swallow it. The liquid was cold against my throat, a silver bullet disguised as a daughter's mercy. It had a faint, chalky texture that coated my tongue, the taste of a slow-acting execution. I drank every drop, my eyes locked on hers, searching for a flicker of regret, a momentary lapse in the mask. There was nothing. Only a predatory brightness that made my skin crawl. The poison acted fast, a dull ache beginning to bloom behind my eyes, but the realization acted faster. I was no longer just her father. I was her evidence. I handed the empty glass back to her and saw my own death reflected in that dark, hungry gaze. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice a soft, humming song, as she patted my hand and turned to leave the room. The taste of copper and betrayal is a heavy breakfast, one that sits in the back of my throat long after Zelma's footsteps have faded from the hallway. The poison acted fast, but the realization acted faster. I woke from a drug-induced stupor with the early morning light bleeding through the shutters of my antique shop, casting elongated skeletal shadows across the floorboards. My fingertips felt dead numb, as if they had been dipped in ice water. But the rest of my body was a landscape of heat and dull, throbbing pain. I didn't succumb to the panic that usually claims a dying man. I was a detective, after all. Instead, I felt a strange, cold euphoria bubbling up beneath the physical agony. This was the ultimate investigation, the most high-stakes case of my career, and I was the primary piece of evidence. I struggled to my feet, lurching toward the back room, where I kept the relics too precious or too dangerous for the public eye. The air here was thick with the scent of dry ink and ancient dust, a perfume of the past that anchored me to the present. I reached behind a stack of weathered crates and pulled out an old, leather-bound ledger. "My hands are shaking, but my mind has never been sharper," I told myself as I fumbled with the clasp. "Every twitch is a testimony." I sat at my workbench, the ticking of a dozen clocks creating a frantic, polyphonic beat that seemed to mock the slowing rhythm of my own heart. I gripped my fountain pen, though my fingers felt like leaden weights. Spasm. My pen carves a jagged line across the paper, a lightning bolt of biological protest. I stared at the mark for a second before beginning the entry with a grim smile. Subject Willis. Administrator Zelma. Method arsenic, or something more creative. I began to document the slow death with the clinical detachment of a man performing his own autopsy. I listed the symptoms: the blurring of peripheral vision, the rhythmic, painful contractions of the diaphragm, and that deep, soul-chilling cold that seemed to originate in the very marrow of my bones. Every detail was a nail in her coffin. She wants a funeral. I'm giving her a trial. I analyzed the toxins not as a victim, but as an investigator looking for a signature. Is this how a masterpiece ends, not with a bang, but with the scratching of a nib against parchment, while the predator hums in the kitchen? I wasn't just writing a journal. I was building a cage out of paper and ink. I noted the exact intervals between the doses she gave me and the physiological eruptions that followed. My investigative intent was a blade cutting through the fog of the drugs she fed me with such motherly care. I finished the first page, the ink still wet and glistening, like a fresh wound in the dim, dusty light of the shop. I needed a place to hide it somewhere. She would never look somewhere the rot of her presence hadn't yet reached. I moved to a tall 18th century grandfather clock, with a pendulum that swung with a slow, heavy grace. Behind the heavy brass weights was a hidden compartment I had built years ago to store rare chemical reagents used in delicate restoration work. I carefully slid the ledger into the dark recess, sealing it away. As I did, my hand brushed against the lower shelf where I kept a small sealed vial of strychnine, a dangerous sample I used for testing the authenticity of certain antique pigments. My heart skipped a beat, and not because of the digitalis in my veins. The vial was gone. I looked closer, my eyes straining against the shadows, and saw the faint, disturbed dust where the bottle should have been sitting undisturbed for years. Someone had diabolically moved my chemicals. I stared at the vacant spot on the shelf where the strychnine sample should have been. She isn't just killing me. She's practicing for someone else. I watched the rhythm of her broom, a metronome of domestic lies, waiting for the front door to click shut so I could exhume the secrets she buried in the mail pile. Zelma moved through the living room with a surgical precision that chilled me. From my recliner, I feigned a heavy-eyed exhaustion, letting my breathing remain shallow and ragged to satisfy her observations. She paused by the sideboard, her fingers lingering on a stack of envelopes. I noticed a smudge on her thumb, a deep indigo stain that wasn't kitchen soot or garden soil. It was the specific indelible ink used by legal clerks and state offices. She had been responding to a threat, a letter that required a formal signature, and the realization prickled like a cold needle against my skin. "You look pale, Willis. Rest while I'm out," she said, her voice a soothing caress that failed to mask the predatory calculation in her eyes. I managed a weak nod. "I'll be right here, Zelma. I'm not going anywhere." The sound of the front door lock clicking into place was like the starting gun for a race I wasn't sure my heart could finish. I waited for the engine of her car to fade before I threw back the blanket. The poison in my system fought me, turning my bones into brittle glass and my muscles into wet sand. I forced myself to stand, clinging to the mahogany furniture as I navigated the hallway. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, my vision swimming with that persistent, sickening yellow tint. I reached the wooden mail sorter, a hand-carved antique I had given her years ago when we still believed in a future. Dizziness strikes. The floor tilts like the deck of a sinking ship. "Breathe, Willis. Don't die before you find it." I leaned my forehead against the cool wood until the world stopped spinning. I knew this piece of furniture. I had restored it myself. I pressed the hidden catch beneath the third slot, and the false back clicked open to reveal a cache of unopened correspondence. My fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the first envelope. It bore the official seal of the State Board of Pharmacy. My pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I tore the paper. The metallic tang of copper filled my mouth, a biological warning I could no longer ignore. I pulled out the document, my knuckles aching with every movement, as if the joints were filled with hot lead. It wasn't a bill. It was a verdict. The ink felt like a cold confession on the page. The letter, dated 3 months ago, detailed the immediate revocation of her pharmaceutical license. I read through the dense, bureaucratic jargon, my eyes straining to maintain focus. They had caught her diverted, controlled substances, heavy sedatives, and cardiac stimulants. But the deeper I read, the darker the ink became. The paper in my hand felt heavier than the lead caskets I sell in the shop, a weight of paper and ink enough to crush a fatherhood. My breath hitched as I reached the final paragraph. The board wasn't just citing her for theft. They were referencing an ongoing investigation into the suspicious death of a patient under her care at the previous clinic. The term "unexplained cardiac event" leaped off the page, a mirror image of the symptoms I was currently fighting. My hands shook so violently the paper rattled. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had a pattern. I thought of the missing strychnine from my shop and felt a wave of icy terror wash over me. The pharmacy board didn't just stop her from dispensing pills. They marked her as a ghost in the medical world, a woman whose professional life had been ended by a shadow of murder. And now I realized with a sickening clarity, I was the only witness left to her current transformation. She wasn't just practicing on me. She was refining a method she had already tested on someone else. I stared at the official seal, the gold foil mocking the gray reality of my life, as the silence of the house grew heavy with the weight of what I had uncovered. The doorbell didn't just ring. It collided with the silence of the shop like a gunshot, forcing me to shove the damning letter into my vest, just as the shadow of a tall man darkened the frosted glass. My heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against my ribs, a protest against the sudden surge of adrenaline. I fumbled with the deadbolt, my fingers numb and clumsy, and swung the door open. I expected to see Zelma's cold, assessing gaze, but instead I found Lennox. Lennox stepped inside his long coat, smelling of tobacco and the Atlantic, his eyes moving with the predatory precision of a man who dealt in truths more than trinkets. He was my younger son by 5 years, a retired merchant mariner who had spent his life navigating the treacherous currents of the Savannah coast. I tried to offer a welcoming smile, but my facial muscles felt like stiff parchment. "Willis, you look like you've already been fitted for one of your own caskets." He barked, his voice gravelly and sharp. I leaned heavily against the doorframe, my vision tunneling for a terrifying second. "It's just the dampness of the season, Lennox." Nothing more, I managed to wheeze, though the copper taste in my mouth had become an overpowering metallic flood. I moved to usher him toward the back, hoping to hide my condition in the dim light, but a sudden violent spasm seized my diaphragm. My knees buckled as if the floor had turned to liquid, and I collapsed forward. Lennox caught me, his hands like iron bands around my thin arms, stripping away my final shred of composed dignity. He lowered me into a velvet armchair, his calloused palm pressing against my forehead. "You're burning up, Willis, and your skin is the color of a wet slate." Lennox didn't wait for an invitation. He began to pace the showroom, his boots clicking rhythmically on the heart pine floors. "You have to understand the look Lennox gave me. It's the look a butcher gives a piece of meat he knows has gone bad, but can't quite figure out why." He stopped near a display of Victorian medical kits, sniffing the air with a deep, theatrical inhale. "It isn't just the dust in here," he muttered. "The air in here tastes like copper and bad intentions. Where is that daughter of yours, Zelma? Usually keeps this place smelling like lavender and lemon wax, but today it reeks of something clinical, something heavy." I tried to stand my hand, shaking so violently that I had to tuck it beneath my thigh. "She's out, Lennox. Just some errands. Don't touch that. It's fragile," I said, watching him lean over my restoration desk. He ignored me, his gaze fixed on the shadows between the bottles of varnish and oil. I felt a cold sweat breaking out at the base of my spine. I wanted to tell him everything, to scream that the woman he thought was a saint was actually a ghost haunting our halls. But the fear of what she might do to him kept the words locked in my throat. Silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind of silence that screams right before the floorboards break. Lennox reached out and picked up a small crystal vial that sat dangerously close to the edge of the workbench. It was the bottle I had seen missing from the grandfather clock, the one I had assumed she had hidden away. He held the crystal vial to the light, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the poison to my trembling hands. He swirled the clear liquid, watching how it clung to the glass with a viscous, oily weight. "Willis," he whispered, his voice losing its bark and turning into something much more dangerous. "This is strychnine. I remember you told me you sold your entire stock of this to that collector in Atlanta 2 years ago. Why is it sitting here fresh and unsealed right where you've been working?" He looked at me, then really looked at me, and I saw the moment the pieces clicked together in his mind. The gray skin, the tremors, the missing drugs. "Willis." What has she turned you into? The silence that followed Lennox's exit was louder than his shouting, a vacuum that filled rapidly with the scent of the rain-slicked pavement and my own rising bile. He had left in a whirlwind of suppressed fury, promising to dig into the muck he sensed beneath our floorboards. I stood alone in the dim showroom, my hands still vibrating with a tremor I couldn't blame entirely on the digitalis. I looked at the glass vial Lennox had held. A sudden chilling realization washed over me. The strychnine was too easy to find. Zelma was many things, but she was never careless. She had left that bottle as a decoy, a glass mask, to test my awareness, while the real weapon remained hidden in plain sight. Before I could process the depth of her game, the front door lock groaned. Zelma entered carrying the damp chill of the evening on her shoulders. "Was that your son I saw driving away, darling?" she asked, her voice light, but her eyes sharp enough to draw blood. He always did have a nose for trouble. I forced my features into a mask of weary indifference, the letter from the pharmacy board feeling like a hot brand against the skin of my chest. "Just a family visit, Zelma. He hasn't changed a bit," I replied, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. She didn't respond immediately, instead moving to the kitchen. I heard the rattle of a porcelain pot and the hiss of steam. Moments later, she returned with a steaming mug, the scent of herbal tea pungent and acrid filling the air. "Drink this, Willis. It's a new blend to settle those nerves," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. A father's house is supposed to be a sanctuary. Instead, mine has become a laboratory, where I am the primary specimen, and the microscope is held by the child I once taught to walk, a woman who now kisses my cheek only to check for the coldness of approaching death. I took the mug, the heat seeped into my numb palms, but I didn't drink. I watched her as she glided toward the stairs, her movements graceful and predatory. She paused on the first step, her back to me, and for a second I saw her shoulders stiffen. "I'll be upstairs cleaning out the guest room," she called out. "Don't let your tea get cold." As the floorboards upstairs began to groan under her weight, the telephone on my antique desk let out a jagged mechanical ring. The sound tore through the oppressive quiet of the shop. I snatched the receiver, my heart hammering. It was Lennox. "Willis, listen to me and don't speak." "Just listen," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp of cold disgust. I could hear the static hum of an old line buzzing in my ear. "I've been calling in every favor from Savannah to Atlanta. I got into her bank records and the underground ledgers through a contact in the Gaming Commission. She's not just a thief, Willis. She's a black hole." My grip on the phone tightened until my knuckles turned white. The shadows of the shop seemed to grow longer, reaching for me like skeletal fingers. I listened as Lennox laid out the architecture of her betrayal, a structure built on lies and desperation. Numbers. Cold, hard, mathematical murder. 520,000 reasons for me to stop breathing. Lennox revealed that she had accumulated a gambling debt of over $500,000 at underground casinos, and my life insurance policy was the only exit strategy she had left. The room seemed to tilt. The weight of the betrayal was a physical blow more toxic than any chemical she had fed me. I looked up from the receiver, the numbers still echoing in my brain like a death knell. I heard the floorboards groan again. I looked up to see Zelma standing at the top of the stairs, the light from the hallway behind her obscuring her face in a dark silhouette. She was holding a fresh vial that caught the dim light, one that didn't look like anything meant for tea. "Who was that on the phone, Willis?" she asked, her voice dropping the facade of warmth, turning into something as sharp and cold as a razor blade. I slammed the receiver back into its cradle so hard, the bell gave a strangled metallic whimper, just as Zelma's shadow lengthened across the floor like a spreading stain. I didn't look up immediately, fixing my eyes on a stray bit of lint on the mahogany desk to hide the frantic pulse visible in my neck. "Who was that on the phone, Willis?" she asked, her voice a silk thread that threatened to strangle. I forced a dry, rasping laugh that turned into a genuine cough, tasting that familiar bitterness of copper. Just a man looking for a clock I don't have, Zelma. My head is spinning, and he wouldn't stop shouting about some French pendulum. I feigned a stumble, leaning heavily on the desk, letting my hand brush against the hidden ledger in my vest. She watched me with those predatory eyes, calculating the speed of my decline. "Go to bed, Willis. You need your strength for what's coming," she whispered. And for a moment, I saw the ghost of the woman I had once loved before the gambling debts had hollowed her out. I allowed her to lead me to the stairs, playing the role of the submissive victim to perfection. I had already begun my own counter-offensive, a secret chess game played in the dark. I had spent the afternoon swapping out part of her medication with simple white flour. It was a crude stalling tactic, but every hour I didn't ingest her poison was an hour I could spend fighting back. I waited in the silence of my bedroom until the grandfather clock downstairs struck midnight, its chime a somber warning. When I was certain her breathing had settled into the deep rhythm of sleep, I slipped out of bed. My joints screamed with a dull, leaden ache, a remnant of the actual toxins already in my blood. But I moved with the silence of a man who had spent 40 years among fragile antiques. I crept out the back door, the cold night savanna air hitting my lungs like a splash of ice water. The leaves on the oak trees hissed in the wind, and every dry branch that snapped under my feet sounded like a gunshot. I made my way to the wood shop, a sanctuary of pine and cedar situated behind the main shop. The air in the wood shop felt clean, a sharp contrast to the house where the oxygen was thick with the sweetness of rotting flowers and hidden arsenic. Lennox was waiting in the shadows, his presence a solid, tobacco-scented anchor in the darkness. I handed him the ledger without a word. He clicked on a small, narrow-beamed flashlight, the yellowish glow illuminating the frantic, shaky script of my entries. He read the descriptions of my paralysis and the clinical observations of Zelma's methods, his face hardening into a mask of stone. "If we go to the law now, she'll burn this book and vanish. We need the bottle, Willis." He said, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the hum of the night insects. I nodded, my resolve hardening. "I am the bait, Lennox. I will document my own ending if it means her beginning in a cell." We formed a pact there amidst the scent of fresh sawdust and turpentine. We would not act prematurely. We would watch record and wait for her to grow overconfident. How many men have sat in the dark, with their sons plotting the downfall of the daughter who was once their greatest pride? Not many, I wager, while their own blood turned to lead. As Lennox flipped to the very last page of the journal, he found the scrap of paper I had tucked into the binding, a meticulous list of the underground casinos I had tracked through her credit slips. His face went deathly pale as he read the names. Lennox looked at the list of casinos, and his face went deathly pale. "Willis, she's not just in debt. She's working for the very people who want us both buried." One of these names, a place called the Sapphire Lounge, belonged to a man Lennox had crossed years ago in the Merchant Marines, a man who didn't believe in leaving survivors. Every floorboard in this house has become a traitor, screaming under my weight as I creep back from the wood shop with the evidence of my slow murder tucked against my ribs. The pre-dawn light of Savannah filters through the curtains in jagged gray blades, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the stagnant air. I move with the agonizing slowness of a man whose nerves are being steadily unraveled by toxins, each step a calculated gamble against the silence. My fingers ache, the grit of fresh sawdust still caught in the grooves of my skin, a physical reminder of the pact I just made with Lennox. I reach the threshold of the living room and freeze. Zelma is there. She isn't in bed. She is standing before the 18th century grandfather clock, the very vessel where I intended to return my secret ledger. She holds a cloth in one hand, but she isn't cleaning. She is applying a thick, pungent wood polish to the casing, the acrid scent of the solvent burning my nostrils. It is a harsh, caustic substance, a chemical that would melt through the aged leather of my journal if she reached the hidden compartment. I feel a bead of cold sweat trace a path down my spine, not from the poison this time, but from the sheer proximity of my ruin. Stop. Look at her fingers. They aren't cleaning. They're searching. She's a vulture in a housecoat. I see her pause, her gaze dropping to the Persian rug beneath my feet. I follow her eyes and see it a single bright fleck of pine sawdust, a silent witness to my late-night excursion. "You're up early, Willis, and you smell like the dead trees in the back," she says, her voice devoid of its usual melodic artifice. She doesn't turn around, but I can see her reflection in the glass of the clock, face her eyes narrowed and cold. I force my heart to steady, suppressing the tremor in my hands by gripping the doorframe. The dampness makes the wood swell, Zelma. "I was just checking the casings to make sure the humidity hasn't warped the internal gears," I reply, my voice carrying the dry academic weight I've used to explain antiques for 40 years. I walk toward her, ignoring the protest of my lungs, and place a hand on the clock's shoulder. "Why are you so interested in my clocks lately, Zelma? Or are you looking for a place to hide more letters from the pharmacy board?" The air between us hardens instantly. It is a detective's gambit, throwing a known truth into the fire to obscure a hidden one. Her hand stops moving. The rag remains pressed against the mahogany. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're becoming delusional, Willis. It's the illness talking. Perhaps your mind is finally failing along with your legs." I step closer, invading her personal space using the very frailty she created as a weapon of psychological pressure. "I know about the revocation." I whisper, my eyes locking onto hers in the reflection. "I know you've been diverting drugs. Are you planning to use my shop as a pharmacy for your new friends? Or is there another reason you're scrubbing my house like you're trying to wash away a crime?" You see, a good detective doesn't just find the truth. He creates a bigger lie to protect it. And right now, I am the best liar in Savannah. I let a flash of false jealousy color my tone, implying I suspect she has a lover involved in her financial mess. She scoffs, but the defensive posture takes hold. She steps away from the clock, the solvent bottle clutched tightly in her hand. "You should be careful about the accusations you hurl," she says, her composure fracturing, "especially when your dear son is so fond of the Sapphire Lounge. If he's still keeping company with the men there, he's as much a fool as you are." She leans in close, her breath smelling of mint and something metallic, and whispers, "If I were you, Willis, I'd stop worrying about my letters and start worrying about why your son's car is still parked 3 blocks away. Fear is a physical weight, a cold stone in the gut. But curiosity is the wire that keeps my trembling legs moving, dragging me into the shadows of the upper landing." I watched Zelma through the gap in the banister, my breath held tight, as I observed the daughter I had shielded from the world now moving through the kitchen like a specter of doom. I realized then that Lennox's exposed car wasn't a mistake of a careless man. He was playing the long game, drawing her eye away from my small rebellions to make himself the obvious looming threat. I settled into the curve of the stairs, the cold wood of the banister biting into my palms as I strained to hear. The sharp ring of the kitchen phone sliced through the morning air. Zelma answered on the second ring. Suddenly, a sound I hadn't heard in years erupted from her, a jagged, soulful sob. "Please, just 3 more days," she pleaded, her voice thick with a desperation that sounded terrifyingly real. "He's fading. I can see it in his eyes. The shop will be mine soon, and every cent will be yours. I know the debt is high. I'm doing everything I can." She sounded like a broken woman, a victim of circumstance clinging to a fraying rope. But then, as abruptly as a candle being snuffed out, the sobbing stopped. She clicked the receiver back into place, and the silence that followed was chilling. How can a voice carry so much grief one second and such clinical indifference the next? Is the human soul really that easy to switch off? I watched as she took a deep, steadying breath, her posture shifting from a collapsed wreck to a poised professional. She began to hum a low, haunting folk tune, a melody from her childhood that used to bring me peace, but now sounded like a dirge. She moved toward the stove to prepare a bowl of oatmeal, the steam rising in the harsh morning light that flooded the kitchen. Her movements were fluid and practiced. I saw her reach for a small, unassuming jar, hidden beneath the false bottom of her tea canister. With the steady hands of the pharmacist she used to be, she tapped a fine white powder into my breakfast. She stirred it with a silver spoon, the metal clinking against the porcelain with a rhythmic, hypnotic sound. "Breakfast is served, my love," she whispered to the empty room, her voice dripping with a terrifying tenderness. "Just a little something to help you find peace. Stir, stir." The silver spoon clinks against the porcelain, a funeral bell for the living. My stomach turned bile rising in my throat at the sight of her domestic diligence. But she wasn't finished. My eyes widened as she moved toward the sideboard, where I kept a bottle of expensive Merlot intended as a gift for Lennox to mark his return. She uncorked it with practiced ease and tipped a small vial of amber liquid into the dark red wine. She swirled the bottle gently, watching the poison vanish into the vintage, ensuring that if the oatmeal didn't claim me, the celebration with my son would claim us both. The calculation was breathtaking in its cruelty. She was tidying up the loose ends of her life with the same efficiency she used to organize the antique showroom. I felt a sudden sharp pang of clarity. I wasn't just a husband to her anymore. I was a ledger entry that needed to be balanced to zero. She set the bottle back exactly where it had been, not a millimeter out of place. She smoothed her apron and looked directly toward the stairs, the mask of the grieving daughter perfectly reinstalled on her features. "Willis, I know you're there, darling. Your oatmeal is getting cold," she called out. The warmth in her tone was a masterclass in deception, a siren song designed to lure me to a table set for my own wake. I leaned back into the shadows, my heart thudding against the letter in my pocket, knowing the next few minutes would determine which one of us walked out of this house alive. I descended the stairs with the careful deliberation of a man walking a tightrope over a pit of vipers, focusing on the rhythmic thud of my heart against my ribs. Each step felt like a heavy commitment, a slow march toward a stage where the only possible ending was a final curtain. Zelma was already seated, her face a calm mask of domesticity that betrayed none of the poisonous intent I had witnessed from the shadows. I sat across from her, the oak table between us, feeling as vast as a desert. She pushed the bowl toward me, the steam carrying the scent of cinnamon and oats, a smell that should have been comforting, but now turned my stomach. "You've outdone yourself today, Zelma. It has a unique bite," I said, my voice maintaining a dry, appreciative rasp. She watched me with an intensity that made the hair on my neck stand up. "Eat up, Willis. You need to be finished before the mail arrives," she replied, her eyes never leaving my spoon. I lifted the first bite, carefully concealing the small portion in the folds of a heavy linen napkin clutched in my left hand. I made a show of swallowing, but as I did, I realized with a jolt of terror that the game was more dangerous than I had calculated. A genuine wave of dizziness crashed over me. The residual toxins from the past week, combined with the spike of adrenaline, began to seize my nervous system. The numbness wasn't just an act anymore. It was a creeping frost in my fingertips. I saw my hand tremble, a rhythmic shaking that I couldn't stop. It was time. I let the spoon clatter into the bowl, the sound like a gunshot in the small room. My arm swept across the table, catching my water glass. Crash. The porcelain shatters. Gravity claims me, and the floor welcomes my cheek with a cold, uncaring embrace. I sprawled onto the tile, my limbs flailing in a simulated seizure that quickly transitioned into a deathly stillness. The cold touch of the kitchen floor tiles was the only thing keeping me anchored to reality as the world tilted. For a long, suffocating minute, there was no sound but the ticking of the kitchen clock. Then the soft scuff of slippers. Zelma didn't scream. She didn't rush to the phone. I heard her chair scrape back, and then the rustle of her dress as she knelt beside me. The scent of lavender from her perfume enveloped me, a floral shroud that made my skin crawl. Her hand, cool and steady, began to stroke my hair with a terrifying tenderness. "I'm so sorry, my sweet Willis. But dead men don't have gambling debts," she whispered directly into my ear. Her breath was hot, a stark contrast to the icy tile against my face. "You were always too good for this world, and certainly too good for me. Is this what it's like to hear your own eulogy delivered by your executioner, a whisper of regret soaked in the scent of lavender and murder?" I lay there, a silent detective, recording every word of her twisted confession. She spoke of the silence of the house and how she would miss the way I looked at my clocks. Yet her voice remained clinical, a pharmacist documenting the end of a successful trial. Then the tone changed. The tenderness vanished, replaced by a sharp, hurried intent. I heard the clatter of metal as she began to move her hands, no longer caressing, but searching. She was after the evidence. I felt her fingers dig into my vest, moving with a frantic precision. She wasn't waiting for my heart to stop. She was racing against time. Her fingers brushed against the pocket where I'd hidden the journal entry and the pharmacy board letter. Her breathing hitched. "What's this, Willis?" She mused, her voice losing its softness and becoming as sharp as a scalpel. "You've been keeping secrets from your grieving daughter." I remained paralyzed, every muscle screaming to react, as I felt her pull the folded paper from my grip. The smell of roasted turkey shouldn't feel like a shroud, but as I sat at the head of the table, every succulent scent felt like a masked threat from the woman carving the meat. I had surfaced from that dark, tile-cold delirium to find myself in my own bed, the room thick with the amber glow of a dying Thanksgiving afternoon. Lennox was there, standing by the window with a look of grim determination. He had arrived shortly after my collapse, interrupting Zelma just as she was inspecting the pharmacy board letter. With a seasoned gambler's poker face, he had snatched the paper away, claiming it was a personal note regarding a family inheritance he needed me to sign, effectively neutralizing her curiosity before she could process the incriminating letterhead. I forced myself upright, the blood in my veins feeling like slush. I had to play the part. I had to descend to the dining room and sit through the charade of a holiday feast. As I walked down the hall, Lennox leaned in close, his voice a mere vibration. "I emptied that vintage she was so keen on," he whispered. "Poured the whole poison-soaked bottle into the vase in the foyer and replaced it with a decent Merlot I had in my satchel. She didn't see a thing." We entered the dining room where the candles were already lit, their flickers casting long, dancing shadows of Zelma against the wallpaper. "You gave us quite a scare, Willis. Zelma thought you'd seen a ghost," Lennox said loudly, his eyes tracking Zelma as she entered with the silver platter. "I'm fine, Lennox. Just the heat of the kitchen caught up with me," I replied, my voice thin but steady. I took my place at the head of the table, the silver fork in my hand, feeling like a block of ice. Zelma looked at me, her smile wide and perfect, but her eyes were searching my face for the lingering effects of the strychnine she thought I'd ingested. The silver gravy boat sat between us like a polished skull, reflecting our distorted faces back at us in a funhouse mirror of domestic bliss. The meal began with a suffocating formality. The scuff of knives against porcelain was the only music we had. Zelma was the picture of a devoted daughter serving generous portions of turkey and dressing her movements fluid and gracious. Yet every time she spoke, the words felt like they were coated in a fine, bitter dust. "A toast to family and to the legacies we leave behind when we're gone," she said, lifting her glass. Her eyes stayed locked on Lennox as he raised his own glass. I watched him closely, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Careful with that vintage, Lennox. It has a habit of lingering," I said, our eyes meeting in a silent exchange of understanding. He took a long, slow sip of the substituted wine, smacking his lips in mock appreciation. Zelma's expression didn't change, but I saw a flicker of confusion in the way she gripped her napkin. She expected him to falter, expected the amber liquid she'd added to the wine to begin its work. Clink, glass against glass. A sound as sharp as a razor cutting through the forced laughter. We sat there in the silence of a battlefield, the three of us bound together by secrets and the scent of sage. I looked at the dark red wine in my glass, knowing it was now safe, yet I couldn't bring myself to drink. The psychological toll was heavier than the physical poison. As the meal drew to a close, Zelma wiped her mouth with a silk napkin, her eyes suddenly gleaming with a predatory triumph that chilled me more than the winter air outside. She leaned back, her shadow stretching across the table like a predatory bird. "The law should be here any minute, Willis. We wouldn't want your affairs to be in disorder, would we? I've invited the estate attorney to join us for coffee. It's time we finalized the new terms of your will." The doorbell hadn't even rung before my phone vibrated against my thigh, a frantic, rhythmic buzzing that felt like a death rattle in the expectant silence of the dining room. Zelma was still smoothing her silk napkin, her face a mask of predatory triumph as she awaited the lawyer she had summoned to gut my estate. I glanced at Lennox. He saw the flicker of alarm in my eyes and stood up, offering a practiced, casual apology about needing to check a vintage bottle in the foyer. I watched him slip out the shadows of the hallway, swallowing his tall frame. A moment later, I heard the faint whistle of the wind through the balcony door as he stepped onto the porch. Lennox was gone for less than 3 minutes, but when he returned, the man who walked back into the light of the chandelier was not the same son who had left. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with a raw, terrifying fury that made the fine crystal on the table seem to tremble. He didn't sit down. Instead, he leaned against the mahogany sideboard, his knuckles white. He tapped his phone twice and set it on the table, the screen facing me. Ria's voice, usually a melody of southern grace, was now a jagged glass shard of terror over the phone line, leaking out from the speaker in a low, distorted stream. "Uncle Lennox, please." She signed my name to things my daughter sobbed, her words cutting through my chest like a dull saw. "They're coming for the house, and they're coming for him. There are men here, Uncle. They say I owe them hundreds of thousands." Zelma had not just forged my name. She had used my granddaughter's identity as collateral for her debts, throwing Ria to the wolves of the gambling underworld to save her own skin. Have you ever heard a heartbreak over a fiber optic cable? It sounds like a sharp intake of breath and a sob that never quite reaches the throat. I felt the last of my mercy evaporate, replaced by a cold, surgical need for retribution. "Stay where you are, Ria. Lock the doors. I'm ending this tonight," Lennox said into the phone before ending the call. He looked at me and I saw the signal. We were done waiting for the perfect legal trap. Zelma sat frozen, her fork halfway to her mouth, the first cracks appearing in her porcelain composure. Lennox took a slow, deliberate sip of the wine, the safe wine he had swapped earlier, and let the bitterness of the moment settle on his tongue. "Funny how Ria has your eyes, Willis, but none of the darkness currently occupying this room," he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly snarl. Zelma tried to laugh, but it came out as a brittle, defensive chirp. "I don't know what delusions you two are sharing, but the lawyer will be here to clear everything up. Legacies aren't built on paper, Zelma. They're built on blood. And yours is running thin," Lennox countered, slamming his hand onto the table. The force of it made the silver gravy boat jump, its reflection of our faces twisting into grotesque shapes. He was no longer the observant, silent partner. He was the hammer. He began to recount the names of the casinos, the dates of the loans, and the specific documents Ria had found, each word a physical blow to Zelma's authority. The chess pieces were no longer being moved. We were throwing the whole board at the wall to see which side bled first. Zelma's eyes darted toward the front door, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The wind howled outside, rattling the window panes, as if the house itself were screaming for justice. A heavy knock echoed through the house, but it wasn't the rhythmic tap of a lawyer. It was the insistent, violent pounding of someone who didn't care about the law at all. The frames on the wall shuddered with the force of the blows, and the air in the room turned ice cold. The house groaned under the weight of the secrets it held, a hollow sound that matched the cavernous ache in my chest as I closed the library door on the chaos outside. Beyond the heavy oak panels, I could still hear the muffled rumble of voices from the porch, where Lennox was dealing with the persistent intruders. But here, amidst the familiar scent of old paper and dust, the world felt precariously still. I moved toward my heavy mahogany desk, the dim light of a single brass lamp flickering rhythmically as if it were struggling for its very breath. My fingers, still trembling slightly from the week's steady intake of toxins, pulled open a concealed drawer that had remained locked for several years. Inside lay a leather-bound photo album, its surface rough with a fine layer of gray grit. I opened it to a picture of Rhea as a young girl, her southern grace already evident in her wide, trusting smile. "You were supposed to be safe here, Rhea," I whispered to the empty room, feeling the weight of my own failures. "I let a viper, your own aunt, lead you to the very edge of the pit." As I turned the brittle page, my heart stuttered with a sharp, cold shock. Tucked behind a photo of Rhea's first writing lesson was a small, cream-colored envelope I had never seen before. I pulled it out, my pulse thrumming frantically against the paper. It was a duplicate life insurance policy for my daughter, but the beneficiary line had been crudely and systematically altered. Zelma had bypassed me entirely, redirecting the potential payout to an offshore shell company. The cold realization settled deep in my marrow. She wasn't just waiting for me to die. She was preparing for a world where Rhea was worth more as a claim than a living soul. Memories are like antique glass, beautiful until they shatter, and then they only exist to draw blood from the hands that try to hold them. I looked at a photo from Rhea's graduation day. Zelma stood beside her, the perfect picture of maternal pride, her arm draped possessively around my daughter's shoulders. I remember that day with agonizing clarity. I remember how Zelma insisted on handling every piece of paperwork for Rhea's postgraduate trust, claiming she wanted to ensure the girl's future was ironclad and secure. Now I saw the predatory truth behind that manufactured smile. Every question she had asked about Rhea's social security number, every pretend worry about her credit score, had been nothing more than a reconnaissance mission. She didn't just want my money. She wanted to burn the very ground you walk on, I realized with a sickening, heavy clarity. Lennox is right. There is no middle ground left for mercy. The rain began to tap against the library window, a soft, insistent rhythm that sounded like ghostly fingers demanding entry into my sanctuary. I sank into my armchair, the numb feeling of the old photos beneath my fingertips, a stark contrast to the slick, modern treachery I held in the other hand. I had spent decades restoring the broken things of the past, thinking I could fix a family the same way I fixed a clock. But some gears are far too rusted to save, and some hearts are designed solely for destruction. Tick, tick. The grandfather clock in the hall counts down, not to tomorrow, but to the end of the lie. I flipped the childhood photo over, seeking some small comfort in a date or a location. Instead, I found a line of Zelma's sharp, slanted handwriting at the bottom. It was a date 3 years in the future from when the photo was taken, followed by a dollar amount, and the word due. She had been calculating Rhea's expiration date before the girl had even reached adulthood. The library door creaked open, but it wasn't Lennox returning from the porch. A shadow fell across Rhea's smiling face in the photo, and the smell of lavender Zelma's perfume filled the room like a suffocating fog. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. The scent of lavender and the soft rattle of china were enough to tell me that the spider had finally decided to visit the center of the web. Zelma walked into the library, her silhouette casting a long, deceptive shadow across the rows of silent books. She was carrying a silver tray with a single cup of late-night tea, the steam rising in thin, ghostly ribbons that carried the cloying aroma of her signature perfume. Her smile was a masterpiece of manufactured concern, though it failed to reach the cold, calculating depths of her eyes. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Willis," Your heart can't take this excitement, she said, her voice dripping with a sweetness that I now recognized as pure venom. She set the tray down on the edge of the mahogany desk, her fingers lingering near the incriminating documents I had just been reviewing. I watched the slight tremor in her hand, a telltale sign of the anxiety she was trying so desperately to hide behind that mask of Southern hospitality. I knew exactly what was in that porcelain cup. It wasn't the usual slow-acting toxin she had been seasoning my meals with for months. My contact working discreetly during the chaos outside had warned me of her shift in strategy. She had pivoted to a heavy sedative, something potent enough to drop me into a deep, unrecoverable sleep, so she could systematically scrub the library of the medical reports and the revised will before Lennox could return. I reached out and took the cup, feeling the heat through the delicate china, but I didn't raise it to my lips. Instead, I placed it squarely on top of the independent medical report I had received moments earlier. The liquid sloshed slightly, staining the white margin of the lab results. My heart is exactly the subject of this evening's reading, Zelma, I said, my voice as steady as the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. Do you know what it feels like to read the blueprint of your own assassination while the assassin smiles at you from across the desk? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Zelma's smile didn't vanish. It simply curdled. She reached out her nails, clicking against the tray as she tried to pull the folder away, but I pinned it down with the weight of my hand. I began to read the report aloud, the clinical language sounding like a funeral march in the quiet room. I spoke of chemical markers and metabolic disruptions, tracing the journey of the digoxin she had been slipping into my supplements. She tried to interrupt, her voice rising in a pitch of defensive hysteria, claiming it was a lie, a frame-up orchestrated by Lennox to steal our life together. But science is a cold witness, and it doesn't care about her histrionics or her fake tears. I watched her eyes dart toward the door, then back to the desk, her composure disintegrating like wet paper under a relentless storm. It's funny how science doesn't have emotions, Zelma. It just has results, I noted, flipping to the final page where the serum levels were highlighted in bold, inescapable ink. That's a lie you're framing me with Lennox's help. She shrieked, her face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. I ignored the outburst and focused on the ticking of my wristwatch, each second a hammer blow against her crumbling lies. 4.2. A small number. A death sentence in black and white. According to the laboratory, my blood contained 4.2 nanograms per milliliter of digoxin. It wasn't just a maintenance dose gone wrong or a simple oversight in a prescription. It was a lethal saturation, a definitive attempt to stop my heart before the sun rose on another day. I slid the paper across the mahogany surface, the numbers glaring under the lamplight. 4.2 nanograms per milliliter, Zelma. That's not a prescription error. That's an execution. And I'm not the only one who has a copy. The silence following my declaration was shattered not by Zelma's scream, but by the heavy rhythmic thumping of a cane against the hallway floorboards. Zelma froze, her hands still clawing at the mahogany desk as she tried to snatch the medical report. She expected the local probate attorney she had summoned to finalize my demise, but the man who rounded the corner was someone entirely different. Thaddeus Vincent was a mountain of a man, dressed in charcoal wool, carrying a silver-topped cane and a gaze that could dissect a lie at 20 paces. As my oldest friend and a seasoned legal veteran, he had protected the Osborne legacy for decades. Zelma's face drained of color, turning a sickly, translucent white as Thaddeus stepped into the lamplight, completely ignoring her presence. "Good evening, Willis," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded the room. "I believe you're holding the physical evidence while I have the financial trail." Zelma stumbled back, her voice a shrill reed of desperation. "Thaddeus, why are you here?" I called for the probate attorney. I watched her realize the trap. Lennox had intercepted her calls, replacing her paid-off shark with a man who specialized in dismantling corporate fraud and embezzlement. Thaddeus didn't just have a folder. He had a heavy leather ledger detailing every cent she had siphoned into offshore accounts over the last year. I felt a grim sense of relief as the scales of power finally tipped in my favor. I slid my diary and the laboratory results toward Thaddeus. At that moment, Lennox stepped from the shadows of the hallway, his large frame blocking the library exit like a stone wall. Thaddeus adjusted his spectacles and glanced at the numbers. Checkmate. The mahogany table felt like a gallows. It's not just about the poison anymore, Zelma. I said, my voice cold and hollow. It's about the legacy you tried to steal from my daughter. Zelma collapsed into a chair, her southern charm dissolving into a jagged mess. Willis, listen to me. I did it for us, for our future. I didn't even blink. The woman I had loved was a ghost, replaced by the predator sitting before me. Thaddeus leaned forward, his silver-topped cane clicking against the floor. Willis, these figures alone constitute a prima facie case for attempted murder in the first degree. Before I explain what that financial ledger truly means for our final move, are you still watching this unfold with me? Drop your guess in one sentence. What do you think the casino syndicate's true motive was for providing the poison? Please note what follows contains recreated details for narrative purposes to deepen the emotional impact. The core message is what I hope stays with you. We didn't want just a prison sentence. We wanted the source of the rot. We need the name Zelma, I said, leaning into her personal space. Tell us who sold you the digoxin and who is holding Ria's debts, or Thaddeus hands this entire file to the district attorney right now. This was the final gamble. If she signed the confession and named her masters, Thaddeus would allow her to face financial charges instead of a life sentence for attempted murder, a tactical lie to squeeze the truth from her. Lennox began the recording device, the small red light glowing like a predatory eye. How much is a life worth when measured in paper ink and legal loopholes? For Zelma, the answer was apparently her own skin. You're setting a trap. She hissed, her eyes darting around like a cornered animal. You're all monsters. She reached for the pen Thaddeus offered her hand, shaking like a leaf in a storm. But then she stopped abruptly and looked toward the darkness of the library window. A sudden flash of a flashlight swept across the glass from the garden outside. You think you've won, Zelma whispered, a terrifying grin breaking through her fear. They're already outside, Willis, and they don't use lawyers. There is a specific kind of silence that precedes a storm, not a weather event, but the kind of upheaval that leaves lives in ruins and floors stained with regret. The air in the library felt thick, charged with the static of 1,000 unspoken betrayals. I watched as Lennox stepped forward, his expression as unyielding as the granite of a headstone. With a firm but professional grip, he escorted Zelma toward the upstairs bedroom, leaving her to ponder the confession that Thaddeus Vincent had placed on the desk. Thaddeus was already on his burner phone, his voice a low, gravelly murmur as he coordinated an unofficial security perimeter around the Isle of Hope. He was calling in old favors to ensure the casino syndicate's debt collectors wouldn't make it past the main gate tonight. I watched them leave my body feeling a weariness that went beyond the physical, a deep ache in the marrow of my bones. Yet beneath the fatigue, my mind remained sharp, a blade honed by necessity. I began to gather the remaining physical evidence, the journals, the lab reports, the vials, and placed them into an old, weathered tin box. Thaddeus looked at me, a question in his eyes. Don't worry, Thaddeus, I whispered. I didn't just wait for you. I spent the last 3 days discreetly bypassing the household security system. Every camera and microphone in this house now feeds directly to an out-of-state server. This home is no longer just a residence. It is a sprawling living trap designed to catch every whisper of her guilt. He nodded, visibly impressed by my foresight. Keep the lights low, Lennox said as he returned downstairs. We don't need to be targets before the papers are signed. Thaddeus moved to the window, his silhouette dark against the glass. The wolves are at the gate, Willis. But they don't know we've reinforced the fence. The sunset over the Isle of Hope looked like an open wound, bleeding orange and violet onto the salt marshes. I moved slowly toward the main living room, the wood of the house creaking and contracting as the temperature began its evening descent. The scent of salt water and tidal mud drifted in through the vents, a reminder of the world outside that didn't care about the drama within these walls. I sat down in my favorite leather armchair, the cool hide pressing against my back. From this vantage point, I could watch the Skidaway River catch the dying light. I built this house for Rhea, not for a tomb. I thought my heart heavy with a grief that I had deferred for too long. The light is fading, just like her lies. I realized then that bringing the fight here to our home was the only way to reclaim the space she had poisoned for so long. I was turning her chosen execution ground into the place of her final defeat. As I settled deeper into the cushions, my hand brushed against something unfamiliar tucked beneath the seat's edge. I reached down and pulled out a tiny silver disc no larger than a shirt button. It was a sophisticated listening device. Zelma had been monitoring my every breath, my every private moment of despair, even when I thought I was most alone. You learn a lot about a person when you stop listening to what they say and start watching how they move in the dark. The realization that she had been an invisible ghost in my most vulnerable hours chilled me more than the evening breeze. I sat there in the encroaching gloom, the small device resting in my palm like a lead weight. As the last sliver of sun vanished behind the tree line, a single red dot appeared on the upholstery of the empty chair opposite me. It wasn't the pinpoint of a laser sight, but the steady glowing cherry of a cigarette being smoked by someone standing perfectly still just inside the shadows of the French doors. I didn't reach for my cane. I reached for the lamp flooding the room with a harsh, unforgiving yellow light that stripped the shadow of its mystery. The sudden glare forced the figure by the French doors to squint, revealing a man who didn't belong in a house built on quiet respect and old Southern charm. Silas was a man of sharp angles and expensive silk, his face a roadmap of scars hidden under the veneer of a gentleman's club regular. He exhaled a final plume of cheap, acrid smoke that filled the room with a stench like scorched rubber. I watched him with a stillness that only age and the proximity of death can provide. He didn't look like a killer, but he carried the cold weight of a man who viewed people as mere arithmetic. "You're the prize, Willis," he said, his voice a low, melodic rasp. "Or rather, your demise is." Silas stepped further into the light, his movements fluid and predatory. He explained with a chilling lack of empathy that I wasn't facing a simple domestic dispute. Zelma had used the Isle of Hope as a forged collateral for a mountain of gambling debts. "She didn't just bet on cards," Silas sneered, leaning against the sideboard. "She bet on how long your heart would keep beating." He chuckled a sound like dry bones rattling in a jar. Silas then leaned in close, the smell of his tobacco thick enough to taste. He told me that Zelma was far more thorough than I realized. She hadn't just relied on the digoxin I had discovered. She had also procured a secondary synthetic toxin, something virtually undetectable in a standard post-mortem, just in case my stubborn heart refused to give out on her primary schedule. Silence. Then, the metallic click of a safety being disengaged. The sound of a life changing in a microsecond. The noise didn't come from Silas, but from the shadow behind him. Lennox appeared with the suddenness of a mountain storm, his arm locking around Silas's throat, while his other hand pressed the barrel of a pistol into the man's ribs. I didn't flinch. I felt only a hollow, biting coldness. Before I reveal the question that finally shattered whatever was left of my soul, I have to ask you something. Are you still with me in this darkened room? Comment A if you think I should show mercy, or B if you think the truth demands a much darker ending. Please note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. Bring her down. I commanded my voice, devoid of any remaining warmth. A few minutes later, Lennox returned, dragging a trembling Zelma into the parlor. She looked small, her carefully curated elegance replaced by the frantic energy of a cornered fox. I didn't look at the medical reports or the ledgers. I looked into her eyes, searching for a ghost of the little girl I used to carry. Was there ever any real love, Zelma, I asked? Or was I just a long-term investment that failed to mature fast enough? Why didn't you just walk away when I gave you the chance months ago? Willis, please, she sobbed. But the tears didn't reach her eyes. Silas is lying to you. He's trying to tear us apart. Her excuses fell to the floor like dry leaves, brittle and devoid of any remaining life. You learn a lot about a person when you stop listening to what they say and start watching how they move in the dark. Zelma straightened her back, the trembling stopping as a sudden terrifying clarity filled her gaze. She let out a jagged, mocking laugh that echoed against the high ceilings. You want the truth, Willis? I never loved you. I hated your kindness. It was like being buried in lukewarm honey. I didn't want you dead. I wanted you to watch as I took everything you built and burned it for a night at the tables. Where is she? Zelma Lennox's voice was a low growl that shook the crystal glasses on the sideboard. His frame seemed to expand with a father's protective fury, casting a shadow that swallowed the woman I once thought I loved. Zelma didn't flinch. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed a shrill, jagged sound that cut through the salt, heavy air. Lennox moved before she could finish her sentence, his hand slamming onto the mahogany sideboard with a crack that sounded like a pistol shot. You think you're the architect of this tragedy, Zelma? I said, my own voice a contrast of unnatural calm. You're just a footnote. She sneered, leaning toward me until I could smell the desperate musk of her sweat. I've already signed Ria's name, Willis. A mountain of debt, a fake signature so perfect, even God couldn't tell the difference. Silas and his friends are just the welcoming committee. I'll burn this house to the ground before I let you take a single cent back. Lennox lunged, his fingers twitching toward her throat, but I raised a trembling, authoritative hand to stop him. Zelma's eyes darted to Silas, expecting her backup to intervene, but the debt collector remained motionless. Silas had been a man of sharp angles and hidden scars, yet now he stood with his hands visible and empty. I let a thin smile touch my lips as I reached into the hidden compartment of my armchair and pulled out a small, sleek, digital recorder. Thaddeus Vincent hadn't just been auditing accounts. He had reached Silas first. We offered Silas a choice act as a witness against Zelma's embezzlement and attempted murder or go down with the sinking ship. In exchange for his testimony and the return of every fraudulent document regarding Ria, Thaddeus had ensured Silas would walk away with his debts to the state cleared. The police lights turned the room into a frantic kaleidoscope, painting the walls in the colors of a broken emergency. The blue and red strobes swept over Zelma's face, turning her skin into a sickly, rhythmic bruise. Before I let the law take what's left of you, I have to know if you're still with me through this final betrayal. Comment A if you think Silas's flip was expected, or B if you were surprised by Thaddeus's reach. Please note the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. What matters is the lesson behind it. The heavy thud of boots announced the arrival of the authorities. Captain Miller entered with the weary posture of a man who had seen too many domestic wars end in blood. Behind him, Thaddeus Vincent stepped through the French doors, looking every bit the legal executioner. Captain Dye said, indicating the device on the table. The recording is right there, along with the laboratory report regarding the digoxin levels in my blood. Silas didn't move as two officers secured him, but he offered no resistance. Zelma, however, became a blur of screeching defiance. This isn't over, Willis. You'll die alone anyway. You're already a corpse, click. The metal of the handcuffs bit into her wrists, the sound of a final curtain falling. The officer pulled her toward the center of the room, but her body suddenly went limp. I watched horrified as she collapsed to her knees. A dark, viscous fluid began to leak from the corners of her mouth, staining the expensive rug I had bought her for our anniversary. A bitter metallic scent filled the room, overriding the smell of the sea. She looked at me, a ghost of a smile appearing through the agony. "If I go down, Willis, I'm taking your legacy with me," she hissed. She had anticipated the arrest, swallowing a small, pre-measured dose of a caustic toxin to make it appear as though I had poisoned her in a final act of revenge right before the police arrived. The winter chill rushed in as more officers swarmed the room, their faces etched with confusion and sudden suspicion. I lunged forward not out of love, but to prevent her final lie from becoming the only truth left. The house felt like a hollowed-out skull, the ringing in my ears finally fading into a silence so thick it tasted like copper and old dust. The sirens had long since bled into the distance, leaving me in the wreckage of a library that had seen more war than wisdom tonight. Lennox was outside, his flashlight cutting through the pre-dawn fog as he assisted the police in securing the perimeter, but I remained within, tethered to the silence. I moved toward the master bedroom with the heavy rhythmic tap of my cane. The air was stale, carrying the sharp medicinal bite of antiseptic from the medicine cabinet Zelma had left, swung wide. I stood before it, my heart fluttering like a trapped bird. As I reached to close the mirror, I noticed a slight misalignment in the backing, a seam that didn't belong in the custom woodwork. I pressed it. A hidden latch clicked, revealing a shallow cavity behind the shelves. Inside was a tattered, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't a ledger or a list of bank accounts. It was her personal journal, the pages weathered and worn from frantic turning. My fingers trembled as I read. I found no malice in these scribbles, no celebratory notes of a killer. Instead, I saw the anatomy of a woman owned by monsters. "I am a monster to save a child," she had written, in a hand that looked like it had been vibrating with terror. "I will be a corpse to pay the debt. Willis, you're the only safety I have, yet I'm the one who's going to end you." The most jarring entry was a smudge of dark, rusted brown. The diary revealed that a year ago, Zelma had used her own blood to sign a dark market debt contract to prevent the casino syndicate from taking Rhea. She had traded her soul to keep the girl out of the hands of the wolves, becoming a victim of her own misguided sacrifice. Can a person be both the poison and the antidote? The ink on these pages suggested a soul divided by a jagged, bloody line. I felt a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my throat. The heart medication I had been forced to take earlier finally acting on my system. I sat at my desk, the gray light of a sunless dawn creeping over the Isle of Hope. Thaddeus Vincent entered the library, his face a mask of legal fatigue. He informed me that Zelma was stable at the hospital, but held without bail. The charges were too grave for anything else. However, he warned me that the syndicate wouldn't wait for a trial. Without a guardian at the house, the creditors would descend upon Rhea to satisfy the debts Zelma had secured with forged signatures. I looked at the journal, then at Thaddeus. "We are going to bail her out," I said. Lennox, who had just stepped in, froze, his face flushed with a sudden hot rage. "You want to pay her bail? Willis, she literally just tried to vomit her way into framing you for murder." I leaned back the leather of my chair, creaking under the weight of a decision that felt like lead. "I'm not paying for her, Lennox. I'm buying time for the granddaughter." Money speaks. Even in the halls of justice, it screams louder than a victim's plea. I explained to my shocked allies that the bail would be conditional. I was using my remaining influence to insert a legal rider. Zelma would remain under house arrest here, but her freedom was contingent on her turning state's witness against the casino organization. It was a deal designed to burn the syndicate to the ground, using the very woman they had weaponized against me. I wasn't forgiving her. I was drafting her into the front lines of a war that would determine Rhea's future. Thaddeus looked at me as if I'd finally lost my mind to the digoxin. "The board of directors won't like this, Willis, And the casino, they'll see this as an act of war. The scent of lavender and antiseptic was replaced by the chaotic, honest smell of wet sneakers and strawberry bubblegum as the grandchildren crossed the threshold of a house that had almost become my tomb. I watched them enter with a heavy heart, knowing that the walls of the Isle of Hope still whispered of the violence they had witnessed. Leo, an 8-year-old with my daughter's stubborn chin, and a pair of eyes that had seen far too much for his age, walked with a defensive stiffness. 5-year-old Mia clutched a threadbare rabbit, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. Lennox moved quietly in the background, his presence a silent guardian, as he began arranging their rooms, effectively turning the upper floor into a fortified nursery. I knelt as best I could, my joints complaining to welcome them. "Grandpa, why does the house smell like a hospital?" Leo asked, his gaze darting toward the library door. "Because we're cleaning out the old dust." "Leo," I replied, smoothing his hair. "Tomorrow we start fresh." As I helped him unpack, Leo reached into his pocket and pulled out a battered plastic robot. He opened a small compartment in the toy's chest and handed me a heavy, cold brass key. "Mama told me to give this only to you if she went away," he whispered. I felt the bite of the metal against my palm, a chilling secret from a woman who had tried to kill me but was still somehow a mother. Justice in this town is a slow-moving river, usually clogged with the silt of old money and new lies. The next morning, the gray light of Savannah filtered through the tall windows of the Chatham County Courthouse. I stepped out of the car and was immediately blinded by the frantic light of press flashes, the photographers swarming like locusts. Thaddeus Vincent walked beside me, his hand a steadying weight on my shoulder. We entered the courtroom, where the air was thick with the scent of old paper and the nervous sweat of the gallery. Prosecutor Vance was a man who wore his ambition like a sharply tailored suit, looking for a high-profile win at any cost. He sat at the government table, already organizing his attack. Thaddeus leaned in close as we took our seats. "They aren't just trying to convict her, Willis. They're trying to bury your reputation to save their own assets. They'll claim you drove her to it." I looked at the legal brief before me, my fingers tracing the outline of the brass key in my pocket. "Let them dig, Thaddeus. They'll only find the truth I buried for them." I felt the cold judgment of the crowd, the whispers of people who had already decided that I was a tyrant. The trial felt like a theater of the absurd, a place where reality was secondary to the narrative. Before the first witness is sworn in, I find myself wondering if you, the silent observers of this tragedy, have ever felt the world turn against you for a truth no one wanted to hear. Comment A if you believe the law can truly find justice here, or B if you think the truth is always more complicated than a verdict. Please note these events reflect the chaotic nature of high-stakes litigation, where the emotional weight is as real as the evidence. The gavel fell. A sound like a bone snapping. The trial had begun. Vance stood and called his first witness, Arthur Pendergast, a man I had considered a loyal associate for 20 years. Arthur didn't look at me. He took the stand, and with a voice that lacked any trace of the friendship we once shared, claimed that I had approached him months ago to procure the very toxins that almost ended my life. He looked the jury in the eye and lied, stating that I had intended to murder Zelma first to clear the way for a new inheritance structure. As the witness pointed a trembling finger at me, the courtroom doors swung open. Zelma wasn't in the defendant's chair. She was standing in the gallery, her face pale as a shroud, wearing the same dress she wore the night she tried to kill me. I felt Thaddeus's grip tighten on my arm, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the table. My vision blurred for a fleeting moment, the pale figure in the back of the courtroom shimmering like a heat mirage. I blinked, and the specter of Zelma in her murder night dress vanished, replaced by the reality of a gallery filled with curious strangers and whispering journalists. It was a cruel trick of my lingering recovery, a psychological echo of the toxins that had once dominated my system. Moments later, the heavy doors opened for real, and Zelma was escorted in by two stern bailiffs wearing a standard orange jumpsuit that stripped her of the elegance she had used as a weapon. I felt the heavy metallic weight of the safe key in my pocket, a cold reminder that while the law was busy with its theater, the real truth was still locked in a steel box. When my turn came to speak, I walked to the witness stand with a slow, deliberate cadence. Thaddeus handed me the victim impact statement, but I laid the paper down. I didn't need a script to describe the hollow rot of betrayal. I am not here to ask for vengeance. I began, my voice carrying a deceptive softness that silenced the rustling of papers throughout the room. I am here for the restoration of a legacy you tried to dissolve in a teacup. I looked directly at Zelma, watching her chin tremble. The poison didn't just affect my blood. It stained the memories of this family. It made every shared laugh feel like a calculated lie. I wasn't just describing a crime. I was conducting a post-mortem on 25 years of fatherhood. If the law provides the closure, why does my chest still feel like a hollowed-out canyon before the court adjourned? I had to ask myself if justice was a destination, or just a temporary ceasefire in a much longer war. Comment A if you think Zelma's sentence was enough, or B if you believe some debts can never be repaid in years. These legal endings are rarely as tidy as they appear in books, and the emotional toll often outlasts the prison term. Sentence is passed, the judge announced with finality. May this be the end of the rot. Zelma collapsed as the years of her sentence were read. After the trial, Lennox drove me to the bank. My hands shook as I inserted the brass key Leo had given me. The lock gave a mechanical clunk. Inside the safety deposit box, there were no bundles of cash. Instead, I found receipts and legal transfers. Zelma had been funneling the money she stole back to the casino syndicate, not for greed, but to buy back the forged debt notes they held over Ria's head. She was trying to buy back your life with mine, wasn't she? I whispered to the empty vault. A week later, the Isle of Hope felt different. Dr. Aris was a man of clinical precision and quiet movements, with hands that seemed to understand the architecture of pain better than I did. He was a new specialist recommended for my long-term rehabilitation. The hallway smelled of alcohol and massage oil during our first session. Walking again was like relearning a forgotten language, each step a syllable of defiance against the gravity of the past. My muscles screamed, but I refused to let Lennox help. I had to stand on my own. Dr. Aris watched me with a focused expression. One foot in front of the other, Mr. Willis. The floor is solid now, he encouraged. It's not the floor I'm worried about, doctor. It's the strength to keep standing, I replied. As the session ended, Aris paused at the door, his clinical mask slipping. He mentioned casually that he was the one who had surreptitiously sent my initial blood samples to the lab at the request of an old friend. Your friend wanted me to tell you that the debt is paid, Willis, he said. But the account isn't closed yet. I sat on the edge of the bed, the physical exhaustion of the therapy session, nothing compared to the mental fog Aris had just introduced. How do you visit the woman who tried to turn your blood into a chemical sludge? Especially when her shadow still stretches across your grandchildren's faces. The question haunted my breakfast, turning the lukewarm coffee into a bitter, oily reminder of the hospital cafeteria. I knew I couldn't move forward without facing the architect of my near demise one last time. The detention center greeted me with a blast of stale air smelling of harsh industrial bleach and the cold sweat of 1,000 desperate souls. A rhythmic, piercing buzz signaled the unlocking of the steel barriers, a sound that seemed to vibrate against my fragile ribcage. When I finally reached the visiting booth, the thick glass felt like a frozen wall between two different centuries. Zelma was led in by a stern guard. She was draped in a shapeless orange jumpsuit that swallowed the woman I once thought I loved. You look like a ghost, Zelma. I said the words heavy and metallic through the intercom system. She leaned forward, her skin sallow and eyes sunken, looking decades older than her actual age. The ghosts aren't in here with me, Willis. They're still walking the halls of Isle of Hope. she whispered, her voice a jagged rasp. I pressed my palm against the glass, ignoring the tremor in my fingers. Dr. Aris spoke of an old friend. I want a name. Zelma's expression flickered, a brief flash of the old manipulator returning. It was Arthur Sterling, she finally admitted, referring to a member of my old board of directors I had saved from financial ruin 30 years ago. He's been your guardian in the shadows, paying back a debt you likely forgot. But the casino syndicate, they don't like losing their investments. They're still watching you from the periphery. Forgiveness is a dull blade. It takes forever to cut through the resentment, and even then the edges are jagged. I left the facility with a hollow ache in my chest and the lingering taste of copper on my tongue. The main house at Isle of Hope felt too large, too quiet, and far too haunted by the betrayal. I redirected my steps, limping across the lawn toward the old cedar woodshop at the edge of the property. I hadn't stepped foot inside since the tremors first stole my coordination. The door groaned as I pushed it open, releasing a cloud of ancient dust that danced in the amber afternoon light. I sat on my old scarred stool, inhaling the sharp, comforting scent of fresh cedar and aged sawdust. It felt like a sanctuary from the legal storms. I need to build something that isn't made of legal papers or medical reports, I whispered to the silence. Lennox appeared at the doorway, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the workbench. Everything all right, sir? Wood doesn't lie, Lennox. It either holds the joint or it breaks. I replied, my fingers brushing over the handle of a rusted plane. I'm going to build a chest for Rhea and the kids. I need to remember what it's like to create rather than survive. I spent the next few hours in a meditative trance, cleaning cobwebs from the chisels and oiling the lathe. The tactile reality of the tools began to ground my racing thoughts. Sawdust. Silence. Salvation. As I cleared a pile of rotted scrap wood from beneath the main workbench, my hand struck a loose floorboard. I pried it up, expecting a termite nest, but instead found a small, hidden cavity. Tucked inside was a bundle of yellowed envelopes tied with a faded ribbon. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized the writing. They were addressed to me in Rhea's frantic, looping hand. I pulled one out, the paper crisp and smelling of old lavender. Scrawled across the front were the words to Dad, in case I don't make it to the trial. She hadn't just been a victim. She had been a spy in our own home. I didn't open the letter immediately. My hands were shaking too hard to break the wax seal. Paper is a fragile thing, but the words Rhea had bled onto it felt heavier than the heart monitor that used to tether me to my bed. When the seal finally gave way with a crisp snap, the scent of old lavender drifted upward, pulling me into a past I had completely misunderstood. I read her shaky script, each line a confession of a silent war. Rhea hadn't been a passive victim of her gambling debts. She had spent months recording Zelma's late-night phone calls with the casino syndicate, documenting the flow of stolen funds. I'm not just losing my money, Dad. I'm buying your time, she wrote. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. She had discovered the poison early on, but didn't go to the police, fearing the syndicate would kill me instantly if their plan was disrupted. Instead, she chose to stay playing the role of the frantic, broken daughter to keep Zelma's focus on her. Most shocking was her admission of a dangerous gamble. She had been surreptitiously swapping out portions of the digoxin in Zelma's kitchen for simple sugar water. If you're reading this, it means the tea finally tasted like more than just Earl Grey, the letter joked morbidly. Those days I felt healthy enough to walk to the garden. It hadn't been a miracle recovery. It had been my daughter risking her own life to dilute my death sentence. My heart ached with a pride so sharp, it felt like a fresh wound. Is justice served when the monster is locked away? Or only when you finally stop checking under the bed? I pondered this as the months turned into a slow, steady march toward the future. The seasons shifted at Isle of Hope, and soon the day arrived that I never thought I'd see my 71st birthday. The house was filled with the warm, buttery scent of wax candles and the rich aroma of a chocolate cake Mia had helped bake. It was a milestone marked not just by age, but by the release of my memoir, The Digoxin Diary. Thaddeus Vincent sat across from me in the living room, a first edition copy resting on his lap. 71 years, Willis. Most people get a cake. You got a bestseller and a target on your back, he remarked, though his eyes held a glimmer of genuine respect. I looked at the cover, my own name embossed in gold. The truth is the only bodyguard I have left. Thaddeus, I replied. The book was more than a story. It was a public indictment of the syndicate, making it impossible for the authorities to ignore the fingerprints Rhea had found. Leo and Mia were playing on the rug, their laughter a bright contrast to the heavy silence that usually occupied these rooms. Yet the celebratory mood was undercut by Thaddeus's next report. Zelma's parole hearing was scheduled for the following month. Because of the complexity of her initial plea and the new evidence from the book, my upcoming testimony would be the final weight on the scales. A birthday candle flickered. A secret breathed. The house held its breath. As the guests departed and the shadows grew long across the polished floorboards, Lennox brought in a final delivery. It was a plain gift box with no return address. I opened it, expecting a late celebratory token, but found only a crumpled manuscript and a frantic handwritten note tucked inside the lid. The paper felt icy against my skin. The note wasn't a greeting. It was a plea written in a handwriting I had come to loathe, yet now found myself needing to save. They're coming for me tonight, Willis. If I die, the evidence against the casino dies with me. My blood ran cold as I realized the syndicate was moving to silence her before she could testify in the new federal probe. The very woman who had tried to kill me was now the only key to destroying the monsters who had truly started it all. When I look back at what happened, I don't see just a victim in a hospital bed. I see a man who ignored his instincts because he wanted peace more than truth. That was my mistake. I had solved countless cases of family betrayal, yet when it crept into my own kitchen, I chose denial. If you take anything from these grandpa stories, let it be, this love should never require blindness. When the numbers don't add up, when your body or your gut whispers that something is wrong, listen. Too many grandpa stories end with silence and shame. Mine didn't, because eventually I chose evidence over emotion. Family betrayal hurts more than any bullet I ever faced on duty, but staying quiet would have destroyed more than my heart. It would have destroyed my grandchildren's future. Document everything. Protect your assets. Protect your health. And never surrender your clarity for the comfort of others. I believe God gives us discernment for a reason. Faith is not passive. It is courage wrapped in conviction. Even in the darkest moment of family betrayal, I learned that truth is a form of mercy. If these grandpa stories teach anything, it's that strength has no expiration date. Don't be like me. Don't wait until you're counting heartbeats to confront what you already know. Thank you for walking with me to the end of this journey. Share your thoughts below. What would you do if you found yourself in Willis Osborne's position, slowly realizing someone you trusted was harming you? I truly value your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you won't miss future episodes. While inspired by real-world issues and social themes, parts of this narrative have been dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this topic isn't for you, feel free to explore other stories that better match your interests.